Welcome everybody to our CNY Solidarity Meeting. As we always do, I want to acknowledge the Onondaga Nation, the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, on whose land we meet today. We now have time for some announcements before we go on with the presentation. First, I'd like to announce that village elections March 19th. And this is for the people who live in the villages of Baldwinsville, Fabius, Fayetteville, Marcellus, and Minoa. There is a Onondaga. There's a town hall, an Onondaga County Town Hall, being sponsored by our Onondaga County legislator, Mo Brown. It will be on Monday, a week from tomorrow, the 18th.
I will say quickly, if anybody has more questions, I do have flyers. I'll be here.
Okay, thanks, Mo.
Thank you.
We also have an event around the community grid and I-81. There is a meeting next Friday, the 15th, at Dr. King Elementary School, and it's being held by the Southside Coalition Citizens for Justice and Equality, and it's to discuss the issues surrounding I-81 and public housing, which I think goes all the way to the selling of land, to SUNY, to upstate, and everything that has to do with that is going on at Dr. King School. There will be a micron here, public hearing. It will be hosted by the Army Corps and will be on March 19th. Families for Life Freedom. It's a huge organization that covers various different, all the geographic areas in the city of Syracuse, and some outside areas. And we, through Oceanna and the organization, are also members of the New York Kids, Let's Free Kids New York. I would pick them. So take all those words and just scramble them up and put them in the order.
As said, I'm Oceanna. I'm from Families for Life Freedom Now. We have 5 leaders in our membership that represent north, east, south, and west side of Syracuse. And we represent families that have been directly affected by childhood love poisoning. I am here today on behalf of our coalition membership with Lead Free Kids New York, which is a bigger coalition that covers all of New York and all of the hot spots. So us, Rochester, Buffalo, Binghamton, Utica, all those areas that really have issues with Leslie. Next slide, Ellie. So the first bill we're going to talk about, we can hit it again, is the Lead Paint Right to Know Act. Bill last year was presented by a different name. It got passed on the Assembly and it died in the Senate. The Lead Paint Right to Know Act basically says at the point of sale, there will be a lead test done on every home that is sold. That information will not only be given to the buyer of the new home, but if the buyer is a landlord, he needs to give that information to the tenants of the home. That will always stay attached to the deed and always be with the home. They only need to do the test once. There is an attachment to have a tax rebate, so that would be fully covered. And it's a basic dust wipe test. If they later on go on to do those repairs and remediation, they turn those into their local municipality, that will also be attached to where the lead test was done and showing that the repairs were made. And you should have a little paper that was just handed to you that basically takes you through how that process should work. So right now we do expect it to pass the Assembly again. It's being sponsored by Kavanaugh in the Senate. However, it's still sitting in the Judiciary Committee. So calls for that would be helpful because we need to get it out of committee and onto the floor. And all of our local members have assigned on to both those, with the exception of Pam Hunter. I'm not sure why last year and this year she had not signed on to, the lead bills. I know she signed on to a lot of issue bills, but lead is a tenant's issue. So, also her office would be helpful to get her on as a co-sponsor, considering that Syracuse has zip codes in the top 11 of, New York State's highest areas with children and child closely. This should be our RRP bill, the Renovation, Repair, and Painting Act. So in this bill, what we're asking is that New York State takes over its own licensure of RRP certified contractors. Right now, that is overseen by the EPA. You can go to the next slide. The EPA only has 2.5 staff members to cover all of New York State, all of New Jersey, and Puerto Rico. So this bill would pay for itself, just in the fees that you would attach to licensure. So it wouldn't cost the state anything really to put this in place. We just need to be doing it. Right now, New York State does not really have a clear law requiring lead safe work practices. Of course, if landlords get in trouble with the Department of Health, that sort of changes things because now they need to use an RRP certified contractor. But if you are just renovating your own home or renovating a home you just bought, nobody's really overseeing that process. As a matter of fact, the city of Syracuse, we have been blasting. They are not asking for RRP certifications when contractors are coming down to pull permits on houses older than 1978. That bill, again, passed the Assembly, died in the Senate, is currently stuck in the Senate's Labor Committee. Oceanna, is it your jargon here for you? No, you're fine. So the last bill that we're going to talk about is the landlord insurance for lead-based paint. And that is sponsored by Ryan in the Senate and Rivera in the Assembly. This has probably been the absolute hardest bill for us to even get them to talk about. Back when the first Cuomo was in office, Mario, he actually stripped this out of New York State law so that insurance companies were no longer required to cover landlords for lead-based paint injury. Since then, families really don't have a lot of recourses if their child is injured by lead paint in a home. Suing the landlord, usually they are in LLC, so you're stuck with whatever the property is worth, which usually isn't a lot. We look around Syracuse and the type of housing that they have folks living in. The AG has been bringing some lawsuits, which we are thankful for. However, families out of those lawsuits are only receiving $5,000 per child injured. If you have someone like my brother who is now 44, still suffering from lifelong injuries, that doesn't do much to help families with the care of that individual. Or paying for special services. That's the other issue we have here in Syracuse, and I'm sure some other jurisdictions do. A lot of the waiting list for our children who need to see specialists here in Syracuse is over 12 months long, and families most times have to travel to Strong Memorial in Rochester, which if you are low income, don't have a car, is already putting up barriers for you to get there to get that treatment that your child needs. So this would also make landlords be more apt to get the homes repaired if they can't get insurance coverage. So then we'll move on to those budgetary priorities. So you can go right to the next slide. I just tried to list them quickly. They're on the back of this page. Lead poisoning prevention and programming. We're asking them to restore the funding that they have taken out of, the governor has taken out of the budget. We're asking the governor to restore. So when she presented her budget, she took funding from this program. With the increase in counties, we have more CLIP counties now. So CLIP counties are those counties that have those higher incidents of childhood lead poisoning. We actually added 2 or 3 more counties to that this year. So we saw an increase in children getting poisoned. However, we saw a reduction in the funding that those counties are being given to actually do their job. Also, Syracuse hosts 1 of 5 clinics throughout New York State that is qualified to treat children with really high incidence of lead poisoning. So we're talking about children who need to come into the hospital and be chelated and be monitored closely. Dr. Travis Hobart oversees that, and she took 2 million from their budget. We're asking her to not only put that 2 million back, but actually give them 3 million, because there's only 5 in the state. So right now, if you had a child in Binghamton who needed to be chelated, they would be brought by ambulance up to Syracuse for Dr. Travis Hobart to treat. Implementing the rental registry. So this was a big win for us last year when we got the rental registry passed into the T bill. So that means New York State Department of Health will be spending this year to write the regulations for that program. We expect it to come online sometime at the end of next year. It should be much more thorough than the rental registry that we have here in Syracuse. One of the highlights that we talked about with the leaders of the New York State Department of Health is that currently we have landlords refusing entry to homes. And Onondaga County accepts that when they say you can't come in. Or we have units where there's 4 units, the first unit tests positive, that's where the child is, and that's the only unit that gets inspected. You have a family move into another unit later, has no idea the other 3 units weren't inspected, now we have another child who's poisoned. Had all the inspections been done when that first unit tested positive, we would have prevented any further poisoning at that residence. The unfortunate thing with the implementation of this is that it will not cover single family homes. That basically they don't have the money to bring that in right now. They hope to do that later down the pipe. So they will start with 2 units and up. There will be none of the rules like there are now, where if the homeowner occupies one of the units that it doesn't get inspected, they will all need to be inspected. And this will take us out of secondary prevention, which is what we do now, where we find children with lead poisoning and then we'll treat the unit, and take us into primary prevention, where we are inspecting those units ahead of time, finding those units, taking care of them before children are ever poisoned. Some of our concerns locally is that we expect, because this will be pushed down to local Department of Health, we expect that the local Department of Health, who does not have the capacity to do jurisdictional inspections in this manner, where they're looking at every rental property in the city, that it will be passed off to Syracuse Code Enforcement, who is currently not doing their own rental registry up to the rules that they wrote. So we will need to keep an eye on this as it comes down to make sure that these inspections are being done and being done properly. The GAP bill that you all were just talking about, the energy retrofitting and green renovation and address flood abatement. Basically, it's kind of similar to Syracuse's one dig. When they're digging in the ground, they want to make sure they're replacing the pipes, replacing the sewer lines, and anything else underground. This bill is basically asking for the same thing. While we're at the house and taking care of these folks who are low income, if we see that lead needs to be taken care of, we take care of that. If we see they need new windows, we put them in. If that house needs a roof in order to be insulated, we do that. I also recently testified about 3 months ago at a congressional hearing where we're asking the federal government to basically do the same thing and to use upstate New York as their test, because it's hard to get them to, why would you want more money? To hopefully bring $10 million to our area to do the exact same thing through HUD funding, to say, while we're there doing this work, let's make sure we take care of everything. And then the clean water and infrastructure funding. They're asking for at least 100 million for clean water infrastructure. As we know, our infrastructure here in Syracuse is old, outdated. We have pipes that are over 100 years old, and our water department is chasing leaks, literally every day chasing leaks. So that was part of a bill that we got passed last year, the Lead Pipes Right to Know Act, where we asked all municipalities to go in. That bill was signed into law this January, so they will need to track where all of their lead pipes are. This will make it easier for us to present for funding from the federal government, because we can go say, look, we did our homework, we know exactly where it is, this is what we need, so we can go do the work now. So that's all for me, and we're ready for questions.
So our next speaker is on Zoom, is Jessica Maxwell from the Worker Center. The Central New York Worker Center was a founding organization of CNY Solidarity back in the end of 2016. So we've been allies with them ever since that time. And I'm going to get Jessica hooked up and share a screen.
All right, great. Well, thanks for inviting us to share about our legislative priorities right now. There's three different things that I want to address. So we're primarily a labor rights organization. We organize with workers in the wage sectors to fight for changes in the workplace and improvements in their economic conditions. The majority of our members are immigrant members, but we don't exclusively work with immigrant workers. So the first priority that we've been pushing is the Unemployment Bridge Program, which is co-sponsored in the Senate by Senator Jessica Ramos and in the Assembly by Assemblywoman Karines Reyes. And some of the coalition members who've been working with this came out of the Fund Excluded Workers Coalition, and some of our key upstate coalition partners are the Worker Justice Center, which has offices downstate and also in Rochester, Western New York Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health, Unchained here in Syracuse, New York State Council of Churches, Worker Center of Tompkins County, ourselves, and Justice for Migrant Families in Buffalo. So this is basically a bill designed to close the gap for workers who are left out of unemployment insurance. And the primary four categories that we're looking at are freelancers or truly self-employed workers. We're not talking, when we talk about self-employed workers, about miscategorized gig workers like Uber drivers. Uber should be paying into unemployment insurance and they should be accessing traditional UI. But real true freelancers and independently self-employed workers who currently are left out, domestic workers, day laborers, certain construction workers who are paid in cash, who also fall out of that protection, immigrants without work authorization who currently pay millions of dollars into our UI system but cannot collect any kinds of benefits through it, and people who are in re-entry and have been recently incarcerated who often work in prison but earn so little because they are paid way less than minimum wage that they can't meet the minimum income requirement in order to qualify for UI, which is particularly horrendous in our view. And also because work is used as a kind of a carrot and a stick in the prison system, and people don't always have control or don't have control over where they work or not, and cannot get access to the kind of documentation they need to even prove their work history, that it would be impossible coming out of the prison system to qualify for UI. So how it would work, basically, it would be parallel to the current UI system. Just for simplicity's sake, we think the best design keeps it as parallel as possible to avoid confusion. So it really mirrors how UI employment benefits already work. You have to have, in terms of both the requirements and the benefits that you would receive. So the person would have to have worked at least 3 months out of the last 12 calendar months prior to being unemployed, have earned at least a minimum of $4,050. Those requirements would be waived for folks going through reentry in recognition of the difficulty of obtaining that documentation. And because we know whether you work or not when you're in prison is not really up to you. In terms of the documentation requirements, we had the 2021 Excluded Workers Fund that we were a part of winning here in New York State, which proved that there are a lot of different ways for people to provide documentation of their residency here in New York State, their work history, and their identity that don't necessarily rely on traditional things like tax returns and paychecks. So we had a point system for that program, similar to when you go to get your driver's license and you have to have certain documents that add up to a certain number of points in order to prove your identity. We did a similar kind of process for the Excluded Workers Fund, where people could use tax returns if they had them, or pay stubs if they had them, but also could have a letter from their employer, or could use bank statements that showed direct deposits, or a number of other things that as a collection could be used to document their work history. So there will be a documentation requirement connected to it. And then the benefits provided, again, would be similar to traditional UI benefits. It would be, and It won't be exactly scaled because we recognize it may be hard in some cases to provide documentation of the exact income amount people were making. So the proposal includes either a full benefits amount, which would be $1,200 a month for up to 6 months, or a partial payment, which is set at $800 a month for up to 6 months. So it's really a fairly minimal payment, right? We all know here in Syracuse, if you're paying rent, you're probably paying $900, $1,000 a month in rent, because we have had, there's with this program, no requirement to prove that you were looking for work. And we had some legislators who asked about that. Oh, how will we know people are looking for work? And we're like, there's nobody who wants to be living on $1,200 a month. And there are a few people who can manage to cover all their needs on $1,200 a month. And it's only, you can qualify for a maximum of 6 months. So the idea that anybody is not looking for work is sort of ridiculous. In terms of the impact, this is a program that we're requesting a $500 million funding level. It's only targeted to cover the most vulnerable workers because we recognize this is new. We want to start small and start with the most needy population. So workers, in order to qualify, the maximum you could have earned is the state median income of $56,000 a year. So it targets low income workers. And at that level would cover an estimated 750,000 workers across New York State. That's a conservative estimate. Cornell has done a study with an estimate by their calculations that it would cover actually over 1 million workers. But regardless, it's a huge number of workers who are currently excluded from the the federal UI system. And those would be the workers covered, right? It's an insurance program essentially. So that doesn't mean all of those 750,000 excluded workers would receive benefits, but based on an assumption looking at regular unemployment rates right now and expected uptake by those 4 different categories, this would allow the program at a $500 million funding level to provide benefits to up to 30,000 workers in the course of a year at that funding level. And we think that would be sufficient to fund the program. We know that UI generates an economic boost. So we actually expect that it would generate a boost across the state of $425 million because when you put money into the hands of low-wage workers spend that money in their local communities. So we expect this actually to be really an economic development program. In terms of upstate, what that looks like is at least 90,000 workers being covered, probably close to 5,000 workers receiving benefits, and a boost of $70 million to the region. So just to dive a little bit more into those numbers, in upstate, we had Russell Weaver, who's the director of research at the Cornell ILR school based out of Buffalo, who did a little analysis for us. And based on his analysis, really only about 30 to 40% of unemployed workers in New York State actually are able to collect UI. I think this is something a lot of us are familiar with already. We know unemployment always undercounts workers, but we're seeing that this is even getting smaller and smaller. The portion of workers who are working those traditional jobs that allow them to qualify for what is really quite a basic worker protection in our mind, right? Because we see all the time workers who are precarious, living paycheck to paycheck, who stay in really terrible working conditions because they have no safety net. If they leave, if they quit their job, and then, if you quit a job, then you can't qualify for unemployment. You have to have lost a job through no fault of your own. So even for traditional workers, it can be really hard to meet the requirements for unemployment insurance. And then that puts you in a really difficult spot, and that contributes to unscrupulous employers' abilities to exploit workers. So you see the little matrix here. You have to be able to prove your employment earnings. You have to have work authorization. You have to be able to navigate the system, which we saw a lot of people have problems with during the pandemic, and not have already exhausted your allowable benefits. And it's just a tiny core in the center that managed to do that. But we also see a lot more folks turning to freelance work, especially now since the pandemic, a lot of folks working remotely. And as the changing, some of our sectors have changed as well. If you work in certain industries like journalism, it's much more likely these days that you are doing that in a freelance way and not necessarily with a permanent job within a company, as you might have in the past. And we see not only undocumented, more permanent undocumented immigrants here upstate, but we see a lot of folks who have gaps in their immigration status because our immigration system is just so broken right now. People who need to adjust their status, who have these gaps, or people who have come and are just waiting for their approvals for their work permits. We had a worker who had a deferred action status that granted him a work permit, who applied for a renewal, which is supposed to, by the UCIS website, take 4 months. He waited almost 3 years for his work permit renewal to come through, right? So his 4-month process took 3 years. And of course, his lawyers advised him, right, you shouldn't work because your work permit is not valid. And he said, I can't live on air. I have to live somehow, right? Here he is with a legal right to be here. And just because of that bureaucracy, couldn't get that piece of paper. And we see more and more workers caught in these kinds of situations, right? So again, here you can see that number, that 750,000 number that I quoted was coming from the Immigration Research Initiative. Cornell's analysis came up with an upper bound. They think it might be closer to 1 million workers in New York State who would be covered under this program. The top job categories we're talking about, folks who are working in hygiene, cleaning, maids, domestic workers, childcare workers, janitors, building cleaners, construction, carpenters. I think farm workers could also be down there at the bottom. But you see, these are really essential jobs. These are the kinds of workers who kept things going during the pandemic, showing up in person for work. In terms of this unemployment bridge program that we're proposing also would be a revenue neutral program because we have linked it to another piece of legislation we've been pushing that's sponsored by Senator Gianaris, which is the digital ad tax. And this is something that several other states have done, most recently in Maryland. And so we've had the benefit of being able to see the pros and cons of how other state laws were written to make a really good bill here in New York State. Assemblywoman Kellis in Cortland has been a big champion on both of these for us, the unemployment bridge program and the digital ad tax, as has Leah Webb out of Binghamton, who's been very supportive. So basically digital ads, we see them all the time. Anytime you're, so we're on SU has their spring break right now. If you happen to have been, on Google searching for hotels or plane tickets to travel on spring break, and then you go to check your Facebook page, right? You get pop-up ads all of a sudden for hotels and plane tickets, right? Because Google has sold, doing cookies and then sells your information to Facebook, who then sells your information to advertisers, who then make money, right, off of your personal information, right? So this is not just somebody designing a product and then trying to sell it to us. They are taking information as we are on the web and then using that information to try to sell things back to us. So they're actually benefiting off of us. And right now, these companies pay zero tax on that, right? It sort of reminds me of for the days when people first started shopping on the internet and you would go on and there was no sales tax. And we all thought that was great because you could buy things. You didn't have to pay the sales tax. And that's changed now, right? Regulation has caught up to that. And now wherever you're buying online, you are probably paying sales tax. Well, it hasn't caught up with the digital advertising industry, and they still don't pay any kind of tax. And this is really the main revenue stream for a lot of these big digital corporations. This is the biggest source of income for Google, right? Look at these numbers, $70 billion a year for Google. over $65 billion a year for Facebook, Amazon almost $40 billion a year. And then even when you get to Microsoft, we're dropping down into a whole nother category. So really there are like 7 or 8 companies who are just making massive amounts of money off of this, and they pay nothing back off of all of these transactions. So this seems to us like a no-brainer. So how it would work is it would be a 77% tax on those transactions only for companies that are making more than $100 million in ad revenues from New York State. So by the estimates that we currently have, it would only actually affect 7 companies. And those advertisers, they already track where their ads are coming from, right? Because that's how they know how to target Syracuse things to me here in Syracuse, because they know exactly where they are and exactly where they're advertising to us, right? And our estimate is at a minimum, this would bring in $750 million annually to the state in new income. And since the tax is based on where ads are viewed, right? One of the fears we hear all the time from legislators when we talk about a new tax is that, oh, companies aren't going to want to come to New York State if there's a tax. Well, this kind of gets around that because it's based on where the ads are viewed. And there's none of these companies are going to stop advertising to people in New York State because they make so much money off of it. Even if they have to pay a minimal tax, they're still making obscene amounts of money off of this advertising. So those are 2 bills that are linked. Right now, the digital ad tax, if that gets passed, portion of that funding is designated to fund the unemployment bridge program. So we've been pushing them together. We have a call tool set up right now. If you go to bit.ly/excluded no more 2024, you can put in your name and your phone number, and it will give you a call back. And then it will call in succession for you. I think it starts with Andrea Stewart Cousins, the leader in the Senate, and then it will call your local senator based on the zip code that you put in. Then it will call Carl Hasty for you. Then it will call your local assembly rep, and then it will call Kathy Hochul for you. And there's a little script with that call tool as well, and you can just express your support for those programs when you call. The last one I want to mention quickly is in terms of immigrant workers. We're just seeing a huge need with recent arrivals for legal services for immigrants. And because there's been just a massive vacuum at the federal level on any sort of constructive immigration policy, we feel the state really just needs to step up and show how we can integrate immigrants in a way that respects the dignity and the contributions of immigrants who come here. You know, right now, 1/4 of our workforce here in New York State are immigrant workers. It's sort of this idea that it's a separate group that's not an integral part of our community is, I just think, a real myth or illusion that people hold on to these days. And we have to recognize that, you know, the immigrant workforce is just a part of our community and a core part of some sectors. I went to visit a farm in Herkimer County a couple of weeks ago. I met with 16 workers there who were immigrant workers, and 14 of them were undocumented, right? And that is not uncommon. I would say in the dairy industry, of the farms we've visited, they've done a program for farm workers to the U.S. this year, and we have assisted workers in 26 different counties on I don't know how many different farms, but we have talked to over 500 workers, dairy workers, and our dairy industry is completely dependent on undocumented immigrant labor. It's at most of the farms we go to, it is 80 to 90% of the workforce on our dairy farms are undocumented workers. And a lot of those workers could have a legal case to stay here, but they struggle to find a lawyer to take their case and they don't have the money to pay a lawyer. We helped somebody with an asylum case who had gone to a private attorney. The private attorney wanted $15,000 to take their case. immigrants who are coming here crossing the southern border do not have that kind of money to pay lawyers. And yet we know those folks could stay here and access, you know, and even as bad as our immigration system is, where it doesn't have pathways for so many people who should have pathways, even those who do have pathways are unable to access them. And we know that according to the statistics, only 17% of folks who are in immigration court facing deportation are going to win their case if they don't have a lawyer. And those are, you know, that's probably a generous estimate. And yet 60% of immigrants who have a lawyer win their case, which shows us how many immigrants who are ending up in immigration court actually have a legitimate pathway, but they can't access it without a lawyer. And right now in New York State, we have upwards of 200,000 immigrants who are in exactly that position. They have a case going through immigration court and they potentially face deportation as an outcome, and they do not have legal representation. And so we are fighting for two things. We are fighting to pass the Access to Representation Act, which would guarantee, as you have in criminal court, right, if you cannot afford an attorney in criminal court, one will be provided to you. That is not the case in immigration court. If you cannot afford an attorney, the case moves forward with you representing yourself against a highly trained government attorney, and trying to navigate an immigration system that even lawyers, you know, spend years trying to understand and master. So the Access to Representation Act would guarantee a right in New York State that if you are in immigration court proceedings that could result in deportation, that you have a right to have a state paid attorney provided to you if you cannot afford one. In conjunction with that, we understand there's a need to fund that. That can't just happen. That mandate without funding to back it up is not going to be able to do anything. So we're asking for $150 million in the budget. That sounds like a lot, but the breakdown here, because in Kathy Hochul's budget that she came out with in January, did allocate about $44 million for immigration legal services. The problem is right now, in addition to having this huge amount of need and financial need where people can't afford to pay attorneys, there's also just a lack of qualified immigration attorneys here in New York State. And so in addition to providing funding for the legal service agencies that exist and the lawyers who already are here and trained and can take these cases so that individuals don't have to pay, we also need to create an infrastructure and a pipeline in order to train and provide additional attorneys who can take on this work. And unfortunately, one of the things we see right now is because this gets negotiated every year in the state budget and there's no guarantees, what we hear from legal service agencies is that they are having trouble retaining attorneys, because if your salary is year to year, you're going to go somewhere else where you can have some job stability, right? It takes a lot of years of training to become an immigration attorney. And you can't then just take a job that's only guaranteed for 1 year and you don't know if you have a job the next year. So it's been really hard for some of our local agencies. And we work very closely with the Volunteer Lawyers Project of Central New York, Hiscox Legal Aid, and they're wonderful. But the Volunteer Lawyers Project of Central New York covers like a dozen counties and they have 6 immigration attorneys. And that is not enough. If you know the kind of refugee and asylum seeker and immigrant populations that we have in Syracuse. And that's just one area, right? They're covering Mohawk Valley, they're covering the North Country, they're covering Auburn, and they're covering all these different communities and all these different counties with 6 lawyers. And that's just unbelievable. So the money that we're asking for, about $62 million would be specifically for deportation defense for those folks who are in immigration court who need an attorney in order to be able to build their case to stay here. And then $65 million would be for recruiting and training legal teams, building infrastructure, collaborating with law programs, and creating that pipeline in order to make sure we have people to do that work. So it's a more of a long-term investment, and then about 20 million to do the wraparound services that are connected to all of this in terms of getting immigrants to be able to access these services in terms of interpretation, transportation, and everything that goes with that. And we're actually going to be heading to Albany on Wednesday. If anybody wants to go with us, let us know, carpool. And then again on the 28th to advocate for these, and happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you, Jessica. Now, we can see, are there any questions to ask of either Jessica or Oceanna? Dick?
So Jessica, for people who are self-employed, in order for them to participate in the unemployment, I assume they'd have to pay in, correct?
No, we actually considered the option of whether it would make sense in order for people to be able to access the program, should people pay in some small amount. And in the end, the conclusion was that would be so complicated to orchestrate how people would pay in, and the amount, since we're talking about low-income workers, people would be able to reasonably pay, that they would be willing to pay, would be so insignificant that it's not worth the administrative and bureaucratic hassle of doing so. So it would be fully funded through the state.
Oceanna, I was just looking at this, one of the pieces of paper, the 2024 budget and legislative priorities. Are we talking, you were saying earlier, I think this, that they're going to make a decision, some things tomorrow. Are there some polls, some of these that would immediately benefit by polls in the next few days, or the next day?
Yeah, so,
And how would we, are there numbers to identify them by to this committee?
so the budget priorities won't have a number like bills do.
Mm-hmm.
So as Chris said at this point, call the leadership. What we have found effective, and it's kind of hard to do now with our organization, is usually just picking a time in the day. And we say, okay, CNY Solidarity, you guys are free Wednesday morning from 9 to 10. Call Hesty's office, shut those phones down. Everybody's calling in with the same script. I'm Joe Schmo from Syracuse, and this is my priority. You make it so that you're the only thing getting through that line, because that gets you on their radar. So that's what we try to do. But yeah, calling would help. We know that the gap funding bill is a priority. We've seen that with the issue when they did my house, and they still didn't do everything that they needed to do. But when they did the siding on my house, the HUD funding would only cover so much. It didn't cover the basement windows, which if you're outside or at the reach of my grandchildren, those windows were chock full of lead. So we had to apply for a separate grant through home headquarters to make sure that the windows were also covered. With funding like that, we would ensure that when they come out, they're taking all of that into account, getting all those things done at the same time.
And so that takes care of everything once they come out.
Yeah, it'll help take care of, so you may already have a HUD grant. It helps them coordinate these different things and make sure that if there's a shortfall in the funding somewhere, so our house, we now have to figure out how we're gonna weatherize it. We got that done. Had they had gap funding at that time, when they had all of the side of my house off to get rid of the lead, they could have insulated it at that time, gotten rid of the lead, and we could have done it all at one time. So now, when I get my house insulated, somebody's gonna come back and mess with my siding and have to go into insulate.
And is there a number or a really easy way to make sure we're talking to them about them, and you know, how it gets them to know what we're talking about?
Just the titles that are right on here. There's no specific number on the budget.
Sorry, I have a question for you. So energy retrofitting and green renovation, there's no sort of legislation attached to that. It's part of it. And the question is, leveraging existing funds and programs to basically intertwine or braid or whatever the term is. Who does that, and how does that happen? How do you make that happen?
So basically, local municipalities would have to appoint someone, whether we say, like, we have home headquarters, they're good at that type of thing. They do it, have done it in the past under their, green and healthy homes, where they will take money and say, okay, we have this person, they need HUD money to take care of lead. But they also have a trip or fall. This was before we had a sidewalk program here in Syracuse, and that sidewalk needs to be taken care of, and concrete, as we all know, is very expensive. So they can pull from those. So an organization like that, a local municipality would need to, appoint to handle those different types of things.
And that adds an expense, because there's obviously someone to do that has to be paid. And how do you make that case? So the Syracuse have a person that does that?
Syracuse? No, we don't have a person that does that like it does within home headquarters. The good thing about home headquarters is staff is already there. But you're right, you're gonna have to pay a salary. You're gonna have to pay fringe benefits, because you can't ask folks to come to work and not do health insurance and other things that they need. But for an organization like that who already has that infrastructure, and they may be already doing that work with other grants, it's just a matter of getting this funding to them to continue that work. So for a lot of places, you do have something like home headquarters in place, it may be called something different depending on where they are.
So existing programs would really benefit from implementing this.
Absolutely. Like I said, when they're doing the lead on my home, the contractor came down and gave me a whole list of things I needed to get done. For those of you that know my story, you know, I was the renter in this home at the time. My house was then taken by the land bank. My husband decided we weren't going to go through this ever again, so we worked with the land bank to buy the property. So of course it came with a whole list of issues that it had going on, and the contractor gave us a whole list of those issues. At the time, though, all we could afford after just purchasing the house was to get the grant, to get the lead funding, to make sure the children are safe. Had something like this been in place, we could have taken care of the insulation and not be facing ridiculous national grid bills right now. So now this is something, now that we purchased the home, we have to go back and look for funding to take care of.
Just might be worth taking note that this isn't new. There's a national discourse called Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, GHHI, that's been used successfully a lot in places like Buffalo. And Syracuse actually started a GHHI through home headquarters.
Yeah.
But then in recent years, they've just used it for passing lead money through, because they haven't been doing the full, scope of that work. It's just fallen short of that for whatever reason. So this might help overcome that.
Yeah, it has to do with needs. That GHAI funding is what paid for our basement windows when the HUD grant wouldn't cover them.
Yeah.
So, it has to do with needs.
I saw an article in the paper a couple of weeks ago, and there was a quote from Dan Robinson about the need for, it sounds exactly what you're discussing here, about the needs to be able to renovate existing structures. And so I wondered if he's, a person that you're working with, perhaps, in any way?
So I don't work directly with Dan Robinson. I have much respect for him. He's been around my entire life. But from my work, so I wear many hats. I work with Families for Lead Freedom Now. I sit on the board of the Syracuse Land Bank. I've been working with the Syracuse housing study that the mayor appointed. And what we need to do here is be building 2,500 new units per year. Right now in Syracuse, we don't even build close to that per year. And that's looking at all of our builders, Housing Vision, Jubilee Homes, Home Headquarters, any of those entities that work with us. We don't even bring online 300 units per year, and we need to be building 2,500 per year to address our current housing issues and try to address the future issues with Micron and other companies that are going to come here, or the support. Because when they come here, those workers are going to need different support. We're going to need more daycares. We're going to need more of other things. So we're going to workers. We're not at that capacity and we have to get there fast. So, yeah, renovating some of the existing infrastructure, but when you're looking at some of these older homes and you're looking at the issues that come with them, when you look at the neglect that unfortunately our government has allowed for decades to happen, those come at a costly price too. And we definitely are not going to get there with federal or state funding if we don't start getting private investment and money to come in here to do this. I don't know what we're gonna do. And low income folks are going to be the most affected because they're not going to be able to afford to stay.
Hi, everybody. I gotta move back this way, 'cause I see this pole in the way. I'm trying. So, thanks for being here. So we have the Southside Coalition, Citizens for Justice, and anybody else who works with us, 'cause it's a coalition. I heard somebody already mention it while I was on my way here. The, town hall meeting, which will be March 15th, a Friday in the evening at MLK Steam Academy. And it will, this is round number 2. So, 5 to 7 p.m. So we will have the, elected, the locals, supposed to be Pam Hunter and one of her persons. I'm seeing in my head, so Pam Hunter, Rachel May will send someone, Senator May, because apparently the next day is gonna be that, the parade. What is the parade? The, I'm so tired. St. Patty's Day parade. So we were told that, we're right on the heels of something that all the politicians go to, so we're hopeful that they will still, not only be interested, because they have to show up, not us having conversation and dialogue with each other. It's still very unclear, and the city is complicit in this, very unclear with all these drawings and all these meetings they're having with all of these beautiful renderings. Nothing is permanent, and yet these tenants still have the same issues. We just finished knocking doors today. We'll do it tomorrow because it's going to be McKinney Manor and Central Village also that we have to cover. And they're just not clear on what is going on and who's got the right information. On the heels of it, Pam Hunter's office has agreed to have their own meet the constituents meeting on the 23rd. So that's the following week. I don't have the flyers. I was really just emailing to remind them to send us a flyer because they will bring one when they bring some when they come on the 15th of March. So the frustration continues to be the lack of transparency. The frustration continues to be the lack of communication with the most marginalized area. So as much as they want to help and assist, because this is the most, the area that's been devastated the most, they're still doing it. I mean, it's still being done. These tenants these places are not being kept. I mean, you really have to walk in the daytime over there because we've fallen off of the ledges, off of these, whatever these steps are, these things that just shouldn't be happening, but they in fact are happening. So I asked, and the ask for me is that Pam Hunter has been championing some bills in her assembly person's position, which have not been able to pass, and she basically blames it on the governor. So we can certainly ring her phone. Tina Zagat is her constituent services, and they are at 315-449-9536. Because certainly she can do more than lend a voice. She's actually in an elected position, and she, while she doesn't make policy to that extent, she can make more transparency happen because they're at the local levels. Same thing with Parma Harvey, which is a legislator, 9th District, 315-925-7922. She's the planning and economic development, but she's also the tenants, and championing is tenants and housing rights, with very little movement, it appears, in this regard, and especially when it comes to these tenants and haven't been heard. So they are having a tenants meeting tomorrow, Pioneer Homes. We invited and uninvited all at the same time, because even though it's for Pioneer Homes residents, I'm coming as a concerned citizen, and as well as Sharon Sherman, who also does the tenants' rights. She's a little concerned that they won't be invited to come onto their grounds, but they're tenants. They don't, Pioneer Homes doesn't own the tenants. So, I mean, Syracuse Housing, sorry, doesn't own the tenants, so I'll be there nonetheless. And Senator Rachel May has come and will come to these meetings, and her representatives. However, we're kind of letting them off the hook. We as volunteers and citizens are doing the work of people who are already in elected position. And certainly we can help them, but to kind of go out front, this is what accountability looks like. So I have brought this, but what we're gonna do is MLK School and other places like the stores in the area, I've taken these in their stores, and MLK just wasn't open today, so we'll get them tomorrow. And just, it is standing room only, because we did have it at Dunbar, because it is a concern for all of us, because it's not gonna stop at Pioneer Homes, we know that. These bike lanes and all these other things. So that being said, Rachel May's office is Tatiana Parker. She's a constituent services, and she's at 315-478-8745. Once again, these plans are not put in place in any concrete kind of way. And because it's historical, I went a step, or our coalition went a step further and wrote to the National Historical Parks Department, National Historical, to which we got a letter that just states Pioneer Homes is not considered a National Registry kind of historical place because of the way that I-81 came through there. The fact that there were some houses that were, the roof had to be replaced, and then the windows, they're one pane instead of two, you know, something that seemed to be just a matter of, okay, let's put the other windows back. Because if this is a national list, that's the only way that this may stop. If we can get them on the historical list, you can't tear it down, as we all know. And then we're kind of in this conundrum. Then the funding would come from somewhere else. It would not necessarily come from federal government for housing, but it can come from national preservation, from what I'm understanding. But again, we can address that with our local politicians and see if all hands can be on deck, because this is more than concerning. These people are actually being displaced, and there are homes that are already boarded up. These apartments are already boarded up and no one is there. So this is definitely intentional, and we can't keep letting the mayor and the powers that be, Blueprint 15, they're hiding behind to get away with this. And Bill Simmons, who we're told he's in charge of housing, but what does that even really mean? You know, they can't put all the weight on this guy. So thank you very much. And, you know, I look forward to seeing most of all of you on March 15th, and to tell everybody who listen, because, you know, it's not just a Pioneer problem. It's us. I don't know the correct pronunciation. It's a us all, we all.
Yeah, but, so for Tuesday's newsletter, particularly for Oceanna and Jessica, if there are specific updates, you know, we put something in last week, call your legislators. If there are other specific things you want in this week's newsletter and for the next couple of weeks as the budget process continues,